It's interesting how God gives you examples of the message that you're going to be speaking on, kind of at crunch time. But these just kind of, one happened yesterday and one happened Monday and so forth, so on. But this kind of popped in my mind. We started a series last Sunday called Think Different. And basically it's talking about training ourselves to think different, to think different about who we are, think different about who God is. Hey, Mark, I didn't see you there. Good to see you. Sorry about everything, but we're glad you're back with us. So we've been praying for you guys. To think about who you are, think about who God is, think differently about your job, think differently about relationships, and think differently about life in general. But you ever had those moments to where you have something in your mind that you're thinking about something, maybe how it maybe should be or how it used to be, or you're just convinced that that's the way it is? We had two instances just recently. As some of you guys know, Monday, Jill and I, this was hilarious, by the way, we went to a concert in Nashville, and she posted, check one off my bucket list, we're going to see Meatloaf. And how many people posted, somebody posted, I can't believe you've lived in the South this long, you've never had Meatloaf. But some of you guys actually know who Meatloaf is, all right? And we listened to his CDs on the way down. Okay, I got to remember these songs. It's been back in the 70s and 80s. And I get there, I'm like, I can't wait for him to sing this one or this one. He came out on stage, and he hit the first note, and Jill went, oh, no. It was horrible. And bless his heart. And, his backup singer, the girl who had backup singer, she was awesome. The musicians were really, really good, but he just can't sing, I guess, anymore. I know he had a stroke and all that stuff, but it was very disappointed, and I thought differently. But I guess 2 or 3 ain't bad, you know. But anyway, some of you guys know who he is. You get that. And then yesterday, I get a text yesterday morning talking about how you think things are different, you know. And Karen texted me. It's like, 8:30 yesterday morning? She's like, I'm at church. I have the coffee. There's a bunch of chemists here. It's not Sunday, is it? And I'm like, wow. She looked at Chris. She said, you're supposed to be at work. He's like, I know, you know. So this whole series is to teach us how to think different. And we talked last week about thinking different and understanding that just because you may not be a pastor or a missionary, or maybe you're just because you're not in some sort of quote-unquote full-time ministry, that does not mean that you do not have a calling from God on your life. And we talked about where every single person that is on this planet is called by God. Even if you're someone who hasn't connected all the dots together, someone that you haven't figured it all out yet, you're still called by God. And we said that was the first thing that you're called by God to do, was to understand this, was to experience the gospel. Was to experience and be able to experience his goodness and to experience his grace and experience his resurrecting power and all this stuff. And then the third thing that we're called on, where we said that many people get stuck right here, the next thing that we're called is to share the gospel. And to share God's amazing plan for everyone's life and so forth, so on. And then the next thing we talked about was we're called to participate in the mission of God. And I think some people kind of got that wrong last week in their thinking. Because some were like, hey, the next mission trip I'm going on. That is not what this is talking about. Your mission field is where you work. Your mission field is in your home. Your mission field is in your school. Your mission field may be sitting right next to you. That's your mission field. To participate in the mission of God. And then we're called, I skipped one. Before participating, we're supposed to be transformed by the mission of God, to experience, understand, then to participate in the mission of God. And every single person, regardless of where you are at, you are called by God to do something. And you are to be a part of all these steps that we talked about. And then last week we also touched a little bit on something we called the circle of influence. And every single person has a circle of influence. Now, what is that? Well, that's people that you surround yourself with. Maybe you have an influence over them, or maybe you have a little bit of authority over them in some way. If you're a parent, you have children. If you're a teacher, you have students, whatever the case may be. But also understand that your circle of influence, you're always an influence. You can be a good influence, or you can be a bad influence. But we talked about your circle of influence and identifying who that is in your life, who that is that you spend your time with, and those people that you pray for, and so forth, so on. And we talked about identifying who those people are, and to offer to these people the same opportunity that God has offered to you, to share with them, to love on them, to pray for them, and to understand who they are, who is in your circle of influence. Now, that brings us to today. Today, what I want to talk about is thinking different about what it means to change the world. Now, I believe that most everybody in some way wants to, in some way, change the world, or at least make a difference in the world. Not many people just want to struggle through life and then die, and it's done. I mean, nobody wants that. I think that most people want to make a difference in some way on their journey in this world. Now, the problem is that changing the world is simply not as glamorous as many people, including us, make it out to be. Most of the people that change the world, they really don't become famous. And we're going to look at that here in just a second. Most of the people that change the world, they're really not found in the history books. Most of their names have been long forgotten for whatever reason. But I'm going to touch your memory up for some of you guys. Either you're old enough to remember this, or if you're a student in school, you surely have read about it in the history books. But how many of you guys remember the Martin Luther King speech at Lincoln Memorial? I have a dream. Who's old enough to remember that? I was one, so I don't remember it. But that was remember there were thousands and thousands of people that had encircled the reflection pool in Washington, D.C., and he had the I Have a Dream speech, and that was a historic speech on that historic day. But let me tell you, it may have never happened if it was not for a group of 200 people behind the scenes that made it possible. There was a volunteer workforce of 200 people that were in charge of getting all the buses lined up for the transportation. They were in charge of getting all the permits done. They were in charge of getting all the water fountains in place and all the tents and all the booths. They were in charge of putting the porta potties everywhere. These people, if they had not been there to partner with this historic event, it would have never happened. Then there was another 200 people that had one job, and they were to assemble 80,000 sack lunches. By the way, it included a cheese sandwich, a slice of pound cake, and a slice of apple. 80,000 cheese sandwiches. But yet, you never hear, can anyone give me the name of one person that was part of those 200? No. You never hear about it. When you see video of that day, you never see people making the cheese sandwiches on August 28, 1963, when that happened. You never see any of that. You never hear about that. But these people, those people, they helped change the world, but it wasn't glamorous. Now, the thing is that when it comes to changing the world, most people want to be a Martin Luther King. They want to be known for it. They want to be famous for it. They want to be known forever for doing something extraordinary, for doing something great, doing something that will never be forgotten, something that the world will never forget. When it comes to changing the world, most of us do not see ourselves as the unnamed person that's making the cheese sandwich. We have a perfect example here. The people that come here every morning and unload the trailer and set everything up, the people that are practicing the praise team, the people that are back there with our kids right now, those are unnamed people. The people back in the booth right now. But these people, although they weren't out front, they weren't seeing things, they helped change the world. And there's nothing extraordinary about a cheese sandwich, but what Scripture reminds us of is that God not only used Martin Luther King to change the world, he also used the people making those sandwiches to change the world. In fact, it's those people that made the sandwiches that God uses the most to change the world. And we're going to see that, and we see that all throughout Scripture. We're going to look at one specifically here in a few minutes. But God uses ordinary people to do ordinary things to change the world. We see that in a story, and we're going to be looking at it today in John chapter 6. If you want to turn there, feel free to do that. It's going to be on the monitor as well. It's a very familiar story, one that we actually spoke about not very long ago. If you were raised in church, you're very familiar with it. It's known mostly for the feeding of the 5,000. And the interesting thing about this story, it's the only miracle that Jesus did that's mentioned in all four of the Gospels, besides the resurrection of Christ. The only miracle that Christ did that's mentioned in all four of the Gospels. And most people believe the reason for that is because it involved so many people. Keep in mind, the Scripture says there were 5,000 men there. We talked about this a few weeks ago. It didn't count the women. It didn't count the children. So we're talking 20,000 people that witnessed and were a part of this miracle. If it was a Southern Baptist pastor, there'd be 50,000. But it's probably about 20,000 people that were part of this miracle. And they think that's why it was mentioned, because it was so well known. Everybody was talking about it. So it's mentioned in all the Gospels. It was not only the most people that had ever seen a miracle of Christ, but it was also the most people that had ever experienced a miracle of Jesus. Because in most cases, if you think about all the miracles that Christ did, it usually involved one or two people. He heals someone. He raises someone from the dead. He walks across the water. Peter gets out and walks across the water, with the exception of when, after his resurrection, he appeared to over 500 people. Most miracles involved only one or two people, and then typically everyone else was simply watching. But this one here involved every single person that was there. This is a world-changing kind of thing going on, but the person that Jesus uses the most to change the world on this day is not your typical change-the-world type of person. Whatever that person is, whatever kind of person you can figure up in your head and figure, hey, this looks like a person that could change the world, it's not them, okay? In fact, although this story has been told millions of times to millions of people over 2,000 years, we still do not know the name of the person that God used to change the world, or at least this little corner of the world on that day. His name's lost in history, and yet God used him in a mighty, mighty way on that day. Let's pick up on verse 1 in chapter 6. It says this. It says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on the mountainside, sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? We talked a couple of weeks ago. He probably went to Philip, first of all, because Philip was from that region, from that area. He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have just a bite. So here's the situation. Jesus has performed all these miracles. He gets in a boat. He crosses the lake. He gets out on the other side, probably trying to get away from people, have some alone time. He crosses the other side, gets to the other shore. He gets out. He starts walking up this little mountain, and here comes thousands and thousands of people following him. And that's the way it was. Wherever Christ was, people followed him. Not because they were followers of Christ, but because they were following a rock star in modern day era. Everyone talked about Jesus. This is the guy that does the healing. Everyone knew about him. When he was around, everyone wanted to get a glimpse of Jesus. reality, for many people, it was sort of like going to the fair and going to the freak show to see the world's tiniest woman. Pay a quarter and get to see her. They just wanted a glimpse of who this Jesus was. So all these people are following him. He walks up to the top of this hill, and he turns around. Here you see it's like they're all like in marching, like a bunch of baby ducks following mama duck. And they get up there. It's late in the day. It's hot. They're famished. They're nowhere near food. They're nowhere near anything, civilization for that matter. And all these thousands of people there. And Jesus turns around, and there they are. And he decides it would be a good thing for us to eat. That proves he was Baptist. I want you to notice something in verse 6. He says, for he already knew what he was going to do. Listen, it's not like Jesus was caught off guard. It's not like, surprise, here they are. Folks, he's God. He knew what was going to happen. He knew what was going on. But in spite of the fact that he knew, he still asked Philip the question. And the question is, where shall we buy food to feed all these people? And I want you to look at Philip's response. His response is probably exactly the way that I would have responded. Probably exactly the way that you would have responded. And basically, in our terms today, he's like, are you kidding me? I don't have a clue how we're going to feed all these people. Jesus, if we had 8 months' wages between all of us we put together, we could not buy enough food to give every person here a single bite. I'm clueless. I don't know. I mean, I'm at a loss. So Philip has no answer. So if Jesus knew what he was going to do, why did he ask Philip the question? And we have to ask that question. If he knew what he was going to do, why did he ask Philip the question? Well, he was not trying to see if the disciples knew that they had a problem. Because the disciples knew that they had a problem. You turn around and you have 20,000 people behind you and you don't see a food truck, you have a problem. They were hungry. What he was doing is he was trying to make them realize that although they knew they had a problem, that they really didn't have a solution by the way they were thinking about this, by the way they were looking at this. So he's looking at them. He asked Philip the question. And Jesus is really trying to help them understand that their own insufficiency in this moment, it's not going to fix their problem by what they have. Here's what he's really trying to say to them. He's trying to say to them, you will never be used by God to change the world until you acknowledge your own insufficiency in being able to change the world. Does that make sense? You'll never be used by God to change the world until you understand and realize and acknowledge your own insufficiency in being able to change the world. So which brings us to this. The biggest problem that we have being world changers is this. We think that we can change the world. Without the power of God and the 12 disciples that were sent out in Acts, without him being in the midst of that, they would have just been taking a hike. It's the power of God that was instilled in them. It was the calling of Christ in their life that made it successful. So we approach the task of changing the world with a sense of arrogance sometimes. I mean, sometimes we think, if I have enough money, if I have enough skill, if I have enough people to surround myself, I can change the world. If I have all this stuff and I've got it all figured out and I can do this, we see it in people. We kind of get a sense of arrogance about ourselves, and I see it in myself. But the truth is this: compared to the enormous problems that we face in this broken world, it don't matter how much money, how much skill, how much time, and how many friends you have. It all pales to the amount of brokenness that the world has in it. And we're insufficient compared to that. Anything that we have to offer is insignificant. where do we see this mostly at? Politicians. Let's talk about that just for a second. Let's not talk about building walls, nothing like that. Let's just talk about in general, okay? What does the majority of campaigns run under when they're running for a political office? Josh, you got it. Change. That had to have been Bill that said that. I'm not even going to look at him. Change. They talk about change. You can go back to almost any year that someone's running for a president. Someone's going to change everything. You see it. We see it on the bumper stickers and we see it on the banners. Vote for me, and there will be change. Sad part is sometimes we get change, but it ain't what we wanted to change, right? So as time goes on, if they get in office and you start seeing all these things, all these promises, all this change that's starting to happen, it's just not happening. And it's just not, and they just kind of wilt away. And let me tell you, folks, that happens to Christians as well. And I see it all the time. Because you work at it, and you work at it, and you have this mentality, I'm going to make a difference, I'm going to change the world, I'm going to do something, and then you put all this energy and these resources into something, and the intelligence you have, and you keep working at it, and then you finally come face to face with reality, and no matter how much you do, you have to understand that what you hold in your hand is insignificant for the task at hand. You have nothing to offer because the enormity of the brokenness is just too wide to comprehend. I mean, I think Josh said it on Guatemala Sunday. When we looked at that dump, and there were hundreds of people that were living in the dump, scrounging up for food and glass, to the recyclables and all whatever. Hundreds, maybe 1,000. I don't know how many were down there. They were everywhere. It looked like we were so high up and looking down. It looked like an anthill, and all these ants were going everywhere around. These people were living in the dump. And the guy that we was with said it took, 6 decades, right? 6 generations, 6 generations for a family to get out of that situation. And we sometimes get in our mindset that I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to change this, and we get to where we just understand that what we have is insignificant in comparison to the brokenness that's around us. And this is why. Let me remind you again. You will never be used by God to save the world until you acknowledge your own insufficiency in being able to change the world. We have to have a huge dependency on God. Because we by ourselves, we get tired, we get broken down, we get cynical. The world's full of cynical people that were going to be world changers at one time. Now, I want you to go back to John 6 real quick. This is the part of the story where we get to be introduced to this person that God used in such a mighty way in this situation. And it's this incredible, unlikely person that he uses. Here's what we're told starting in verse 8. Another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, if you follow, Simon Peter a lot, these next two words sum up who he was. Spoke up, because Peter liked to talk, and Peter didn't care who he offended. He said he spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Here's this huge issue that needs to be addressed. Thousands of people need to be fed. Philip has apparently checked out because he has no answers. So Peter steps into the discussion, and he kind of starts, well, God, here we got this little boy here. He's got these 5 little barley loaves. How much will this feed? So we find this little boy who comes from this poor family. We know it's a poor family because it says it's barley loaves. Barley loaves was poor man's bread. It's kind of like here, bologna is Tennessee steak. That's kind of what barley loaves were. But we get this imagination of what it really is. So we know he was poor, and he's holding this in his hand, and it was totally insignificant for the task at hand. When we think about barley loaves, we automatically think about these big, huge loaves of bread that you find baked in bakeries that hang over the platters. These were more like biscuits. The small fish is being generous. They didn't have salmon. There wasn't salmon there. It's more like 2 sardines and 5 biscuits. It's pretty much what this consisted of. So here's this young, poor boy that apparently was the only one that was smart enough to bring a sack lunch on this tour. And he's got these 5 little biscuits and these 2 sardines. He don't have a fishing more from Long John Silver. It's just a little sack. So looking at this situation through our eyes, through human eyes, it was totally inadequate for the task at hand. But look at what happens in verse 10. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. I want you to think about what's happening here. Here's this little boy surrounded by 20,000 starving people, and apparently he was the only one, like I said, that brought food with him. If there was ever a time to hold on to what you have, this would have been the time. If there was ever a time to hang on to your little measly meal, this would have been a time for him to do that. It makes no sense for him to share his little Happy Meal because it's not going to feed 20,000 people. It just does not work. It's so small. And if he did try to share with everyone, no one would get anything with the amount that he has. So the only logical thing to do as we look at it from our side, bro, put that thing away, go behind a rock or a bush and a tree and eat your lunch, and come on out and act like you're hungry too. Some of you guys are grinning. You know you would do that. Take your little snack pack and your little cheese wrap, go eat it. Just don't let anybody say you have food, because it makes no sense to give up what you have, because it's not going to accomplish anything. But he doesn't do this. He doesn't do any of this. What's he do? Get this. This is the awesome part of the story. This is what he does. He transfers what he has in his 2 poor little boy hands over to the hand of Jesus. And what does Jesus do? Well, first of all, he blesses it because that's what Jesus does. He blesses it as he does with anything that's placed in his hands. He takes this little meal, he takes these 5 biscuits, he takes these 2 little sardines, and he feeds 20,000 people. Not only does he feed them, it says they were fuller than a tick. Well, it don't really say that, but it insinuates they were full, okay? They had their fill to eat. And then we're told that it takes 12 baskets to take the leftover food away. Here's where you have to think different. Jesus is God. Remember that, okay? Let's not forget that. He could have addressed this situation any way he wanted to. He could have done like what was done in the Old Testament, to where he brought manna on the earth, and when the Israelites woke up in the morning, there's all this bread laying on the ground like morning dew. They're up, breakfast is served, done with it. Eat up, boys, and let's move on. He could have done also like he did in the Old Testament. He could have said, hey, go over that rock and tap it with a stick, and it's going to flow with water. He could have done it any way that he chose to do this because he was God. But what he chooses to do is to use a little boy who was willing to transfer what he had in his hands into the hands of Jesus. So we have to ask this. Why? Let me remind you of this. When you transfer whatever you are holding in your hands into the hands of the Creator, insufficient becomes sufficient. Insignificant becomes significant. And ordinary becomes extraordinary. Anytime you are willing to take something that is yours and place it in the hands of Jesus, this is what's going to happen every single time. I wish we had time. I would have had Josh share some things going on in his life here lately. Just blessings. He called me yesterday. Called me the other day, and he said, I got to tell you what happened. He called me yesterday and said, I got to tell you what happened. Since yesterday, I'm going to hang out with you, dude. Anytime you take something that is yours and you place it and say, God, take this, do with it what you will, that's what's going to happen. Whatever it may be, that's how God works. Last week I asked you guys a question, and the question was this: what is your circle of influence? When it comes to God's calling in your life, who are the people in your circle? Who are the people that you hang out with every day? Identify that. Understand who that is. Now, today I want to ask you a different question. What are you holding on to tightly right now in your hand that you need to transfer into the hands of the Creator of all things? I don't have nothing. I'm good. No. It might be a gift. It might be a talent that you're just not using. It might be some kind of something that you have that could be useful in the ministry. But to you, it just seems to be so insignificant. Well, it's not much. What do you mean it's not much? Let me ask you something. What would God rather have? Would he rather have $1 from a person that was given their last dollar to him, or someone that was a billionaire give 10% of that with a disgruntled heart just so he could say, well, I gave, I can move on now. That's my bucket list. What would he rather have? The dollar. The amount doesn't matter to God. Let me go a step further. Some of us walk in harboring things, carrying things, dragging things behind us. We are so quick to point out sins of others. And usually when we do that because we're just not involved in that particular sin, but we don't want to talk about the one that we're doing. Does that make sense? Please don't throw anything. But that's just how we are. When God looks at sin, he looks at sin. And he's not going to take this sin and compare it to that sin just because that sin seems worse to us through our eyes. We have to think differently. When it comes to salvation, many people come to salvation, come to know Christ, simply because they want to avoid spending eternity in hell. And that's a heck of a good reason. That's hard to argue with. But there has to be a crossing point in your life to where you want to follow Christ. You gave your life to Christ because you want to follow him and experience him and live for him. So we look at things differently. We think about things differently. And here's where we have to think differently about this. Anytime you're willing to take something and hand it over to him, he's going to do something great with it. Like I said, it may be a gift. It may be a talent. It may be something that looks to you like it's just insignificant and it's not worth much. But it's still something that you're clinging on tightly to. Or it could be your time that you need to transfer over. It could be a relationship that you're in that you need to just hand it over to God and turn it over. Perhaps it's some sort of habit. Perhaps it's some sort of life decisions that you've made. Whatever it is. Perhaps it's some kind of addiction that has a grip on you and you need to be freed from it. It may be an attitude. It may be a separate relationship. Whatever it is. My question is this. What are you holding right now in your hands that you need to transfer into the hands of the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords? I want you to take just a second and just kind of ponder on that. And if you're like most people, you probably need a pen and paper to write down everything that you're hanging on to. For some of you here today, it may in fact be your life. That for all of your life, you've been the captain of your own ship. Today might be the time that you might need to get out of the captain's chair and let God take your life. And let him be the one that sends you on the path that he wants you to go. So today might be the time for some of you guys to surrender to him so he can take over. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing, that if you ever hand anything over to Christ, whatever it is, no matter how insignificant it seems to be, the thing that you're holding in your hand and you need to transfer it over, here's the thing about it. It's absolutely terrifying. It's scary. I've seen people walk through situations in their life that they finally had to give over to God. To God. I'm pointing all the way. People I know that God's taken, and they've given it over to God. And hasn't he carried y'all through? Why would it be any different this time? Because he is still God. And he still loves every one of us. But when we turn something over, we are so scared that if we let go of it, that we're going to be left holding nothing. And that's scary. That's terrifying. It's frightening. There's a reason that we hold on to these things. Because we're afraid we're going to be left holding nothing, and that's just terrifying. Which is why it's so important that we don't miss the most important point in this story that we're looking at. And that's this. When this little boy took what was in his hands, and he transferred it over to the hands of Christ. Not only did everyone there feast like they've never feasted before, but he as well got to experience a meal that he would have never dreamed that he would have had that morning when he woke up. Why? Because he was simply obedient. Remember what was in his hands? 5 biscuits and 2 sardines. Yes, it was valuable in that day. There was some value to this, what he had in that day. But it was not nearly as valuable as it was once Jesus took hold of it. To him, it was like, how can I give this up? I'm starving. I need to eat. But he decided something. He decided the old term, let go and let God. And when he did that, it changed his world. We don't know the boy's name. We don't know anything else about this young boy except that God used him, somebody that was seemed to be so insignificant, insufficient, somebody that was just so ordinary. God used this little boy to literally change the world that one day. And I hear this message preached so many times, and we never, hardly hear about it. Besides Christ, he's the most important role player here. What did the disciples do? I mean, Philip's like, I don't know. And I can see the awkward, you know how you're trying to have a conversation with someone and then there's just an awkward silence? I can see that happening. And Philip like, I got to go fix some nets. I'll be back. Or whatever. And then Simon Peter steps in. And he's got the right idea. He's thinking a little bit differently about it. But then at the end he says, how much is that really going to feed? So the hero, besides Christ in this story, is this little boy. Because he was simply willing to let go and let God. He had an experience that was incomparable to what he had brought with him that he took back out. The reason that Jesus fed them in this way was because he wants to remind us of something. And I want you to be reminded of this. When we transfer whatever you are holding in your hands into the hands of Jesus, the insufficient becomes sufficient, the insignificant becomes significant, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The broken becomes whole. The dead come to life. The deaf hear. The lame walk. When we decide to transfer what we're holding to the hands of Christ. In just a moment, as praise team comes forward, we're going to have invitation. And I know people's lives are just busy. People's lives are busy and there's not enough hours in the day to get things done. And I know that wears heavy on people in whatever they do. But I know that people walked in these doors this morning holding onto something that they know they need to give to God. Whatever it may be, I have no idea what it is. And we're going to give you an opportunity this morning to simply come up and give it to God. Just pray and say, God, just take it. Do with what you want to do with it. To me, I just can't. What I have is insufficient to take care of the problem at hand. And I'm asking you to take it. Also, if you're here this morning and you've never asked Christ to come into your life, you've never humbled yourself and said, God, I'm a sinner. Thank you for dying on the cross for my sin. I want to give my life to you. That's where you need to start. Remember we said that the first thing we have to do is experience the gospel. Let's experience the gospel. And you're probably sitting there saying, oh my gosh, I'm sitting here and I'm going to walk down front and these people are sitting here watching me. Every single person's probably been at that point somewhere in your life. I know I was. And the road that I walked down at Fort Hill Baptist Church on that day when I was 18, the road was about 3.5 miles long. Big building. Actually, the small building was a long road. It never ended, I thought. And then I stepped out, and next thing I knew, I was up front praying. I'm like, what happened between now and then? I don't know. Nevertheless, invitation will be open here just a second. We'll get through praying.